Well, this episode of Stepping Up is with somebody who's been very, very brave. Because, you know, comedians, well, at least if you listen or watch the BBC, are all hard, left-wing, identity politics remainers. Well, Dominic Frisby has dared to be a comedian. He's even been to the Edinburgh Fringe. Dominic, it's confession time. You support Brexit.
I did. Brexit put me on the map with my song.
Yeah, and we're going to play a little clip now for you of some of Dominic's songs. We do have to put some bleeps in places.
Quite a lot of bleeps.
Sir David Cameron, Theresa May, George Osborne and the Treasury, Tony Blair, John Major, the BBC, the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the EU, the IMF, the US President, St Obama, back of the queue, loads of celebrities, Gary Lineker, J.K. Rowling, Benedict Cumberbatch, Lord Adonis, who the anyway? The British told them to off, 17 million offs.
I am never going to forget, as long as I live, the 31st of January 2020, partly because I'd spent over a quarter of a century fighting for that moment when we left the European Union, but also because my main live Sky News interview just before we were about to leave the European Union, and there I was, mic'd up, and you were on the stage with tens of thousands of people chanting quite a rude line.
I know there are arguments and debates about what goes on, excuse me, the noise is quite loud, about what goes on afterwards in terms of trade deals, the ability to make your own friends around the rest of the world. Yes, it's been a terrible 47-year mistake. We're righting it today, and I must say, I think it was a bright, very optimistic feeling about the UK now.
You don't really worry about causing offence, do you?
I do, actually. I'm quite careful. If you actually look at that song, like it was sort of adopted by Leavers, but it's actually quite measured. It describes kind of what happened, and so people are on the other side of the argument, some of them at least, were able to see the comedy in that.
When you've been going around, I mean, I know with COVID it's been different this year, but when you've been going around, you know, Comedy Club, Edinburgh Fringe, I mean, you've been pretty much on your own with this stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, there's been one or two of us. We're slowly coming out. But Nigel, the amount of messages I get from other comics who share the same worldview, they just, you know, don't want to be no platform. They don't want to prejudice their livelihood. So they just keep their politics to themselves. So you find in comedy, the political comedians all tend to be very left of centre.
Yeah.
And the audiences tend to be left of centre as well. And so, and a lot of the time they'll say something and it'll get a round of applause. And you look at it and go, yeah, it got a round of applause, but it wasn't actually funny. You were just articulating a political opinion. And so you tend to find that the comedians who don't share that worldview tend to be punmeisters or character comics or wordsmiths. They tend to focus on other sorts of comedy. But believe me, within comedy, we have plenty of allies. They're just sitting in the trenches and letting the other people
They haven't
go
come
over
out
the
yet.
top.
They haven't come out. I did see, I have to say, I did laugh when you did that song in front of an audience which was talking about me in the European Parliament and YouTube videos. I think the song's called I'm Secretly in Love with Nigel Farage.
Sometimes, when I'm all alone, late at night, I pour myself a glass of wine, sit down in front of my computer, and type in your name. And, I don't know, I think I could be in love with Nigel Farage, secretly in love with Nigel Farage. I'm looking at you, Nigel Farage. I'm dreaming at night of Nigel Farage. He's so brave and he speaks so well.
No, just secretly in love.
Right, whatever it was. I have to say, as the camera panned, the audience did look pretty horrified by it, and they weren't really joining in, were they?
Could be in love with Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, I'm dreaming at night of Nigel Farage. I want to spend some time with Nigel Farage.
Well, we did that song at the Edinburgh Festival. What I've tended to do with my comedy is if I'm just comparing a regular comedy night, I just don't get into politics because it is so divisive, and at the end of the day you're just there to make 100, 200, how many people there are in the audience laugh. But if it's a comedy like Comedy Unleashed, which is in championing free speech, or if it's my own show and people have come to see me, then I'll be much more political. But when we did the Edinburgh Fringe last year, I had a fantastic keyboard player, one of the top jazz keyboard players in the country, and a brilliant drummer. And so we would sing this Secretly in Love song, but with the most wonderful jazz stuff. And he was a Remainer, by the way, and Chad Lalong, and he would just do these wonderful solos. And it was just so funny because it's a real kind of, early 70s kind of soul rhythm to it. But with that lyric, it would just work very well.
But there's a serious side to the comic Dominic Frisby. In fact, there's a serious side to all comics, of course, isn't there? Because in a way, comics are social commentators and often much sharper and way ahead of the politicians I've found through my adult life. Dominic, you and I first met, a decade ago at a financial markets conference on gold, I think.
It was at a gold conference, yeah.
So you have written for newsletters, you've written books, and I'm particularly today going to focus on Daylight Robbery by Dominic Frisby, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Tell the viewers, where did that phrase, because daylight robbery, we use it, it's part of common parlance through all generations. Where does it come from?
Well, there's two schools of thought on. There is an argument. People think it goes back to the highwaymen, but the more likely explanation is that it goes all the way back to the windows tax, which was introduced in the late 1600s, just after by William of Orange. And it was known, Charles Dickens called it a tax on daylight, a tax on fresh air, and it lasted for 200 years. And one of the weird consequences of the window tax was that people blocked up their windows, and so they lost their daylight.
Daylight
and so
robbery.
It became known as daylight robbery. And when the window tax was eventually rescinded, it was in the mid-1850s, the word is that there were cries in Parliament, daylight robbery, daylight robbery.
I choose to believe that one, I have to say.
It's a great story.
You go through, in a sense here, you go through century after century of mankind, of conflict, of war, of so many things that have really marked deeply upon our psyche as human beings, not just here but across the whole of the rest of the world. I know that you're a libertarian, I know that you're a small state guy. I would imagine you're pretty horrified by lockdown and tier 1 and tier 2 and all the rest of it. But do I get a sense through this book that you're anti-tax?
Well, I'm anti-bad taxes. The truth is, I used to think that if we're going to save the world from bloated government, then we need to fix our system of money. And that was why I got into gold and how we first met. And then I went on to write the first book about Bitcoin, which was sort of the free market providing an alternative. And then from there, I started to think, actually, it's tax. More than money, it's tax. And then I realized that there has never been a civilization without taxation. It has never existed. A civilization without taxation, even in hunter-gatherer societies, there's this sense of duty to the greater collective. And you might not pay taxes in money, but you would pay your tax in labour, in produce, and so on. And taxation is as old as civilization itself. And the famous saying attributed to Benjamin Franklin, which he wrote in a letter, was that, death and taxes are our inevitable fate. But actually, that saying was first coined by a comedian about 40 years earlier in a farce called The Cobbler of Preston. Tax of some kind is inevitable. But there are good taxes and bad taxes. The windows tax is an example of a very bad tax that had horrible, horrible unintended consequences. It made people ill and sick because they lost their daylight, and all the outbreaks of cholera and tuberculosis and so on in the Industrial Revolution in the cities were made far worse by the loss of daylight and fresh air. And you shape a society by the way you tax it. Taxes is destiny in a funny kind of way. And so, if you look at the freest, greatest societies in history, you know, the early Roman Republic, Greece, ancient Greece, for example, Britain in the late 1800s, you know, they were very low tax societies because tax and freedom are correlated. The more you tax, the less freedom there is.
But equally, Dominic, they didn't have welfare states, did they?
No. The welfare state in the 1800s was provided by the mutual societies, the friendly societies, and the friendly societies were so successful that David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill tried to copy them with the National Insurance Act. But low tax societies, you know, Thatcher used to say you can't have freedom without economic freedom, and low tax societies tend to be the most successful. High tax societies, like the ultimate form of, if the ultimate form of no taxation is anarchy, you know, everyone, no leaders and total freedom, and the ultimate form of taxation is slavery, where you don't own your own labour and you don't own your produce. And then you have one down from slavery, all the totalitarian states. You know, Soviet Russia was roughly 75% of GDP was government. We're at 40 to 50, maybe a little bit above 50.
I think we're over 50 probably now.
I mean, so, you know, we're going in that direction. But if we're to save the world, or if we're to save our country, we need to think about how we tax people, and we need dramatic tax reform. Our country our economy at the moment, our tax system is riddled with inequities. And
it's complicated.
Oh my goodness! It is. I think
What's
it's
the tax code? 13,000 pages.
20,000 pages.
Is it? Oh gosh, I'm out of date.
forget. I think it's I think it's 14 times. If you took all the Harry Potters combined, it's 14 times the length. It's 14 times the length of the Bible. I forget the exact statistic.
But it's massive.
It's huge. Yeah. And, you know, the super rich or clever corporations or whoever have got the resources to navigate the loopholes. The bigger it is, the more loopholes there are.
We're going to come to those corporations. So you accept the tax, you accept there is a thing called the greater good.
Yes.
But it's about having the right tax. And
yeah.
Through this book, a hero emerges, a tax hero, the man that you look up to and think is the model for all of it. And I'm interested in this because I have a son that lives in Hong Kong, and it's a man from Hong Kong who I bet hardly any of you have ever even heard of. Who is he?
His name was Cowperthwaite or Cooperthwaite. I'm still not sure how you pronounce it. He wasn't actually from Hong Kong. He was actually from Scotland, and he was a great student of Adam Smith. And he was sent out to Hong Kong shortly after the First World War as a civil servant to help rebuild the economy. And he was, as I say, he was a total acolyte of.
And what was Hong Kong in those days?
It was a British colony, and it was utterly decimated by the Second World War. And it had a population of something like, I can't remember the exact number, Nigel. I think it was 500,000 at this point, something like that. More and more people started to come back after the Second World War, but its per capita GDP was on a level with most of Africa. It was that decimated. And Cooperthwaite just sort of looked around, and he was told to do all these things, and he looked around, and he eventually became the financial secretary, and he looked around and he just thought, actually, I don't need to do anything here. People are taking care of this themselves. They're doing a good job. And he was a great observer. He used to walk the markets and the streets and so on to watch what people were doing. So his policy was one of laissez-faire, just let people get on with it. And, you know, by the 1990s, Hong Kong's per capita GDP was greater than our own. It was about a third of ours. And that was another thing he did. He said, if you're to fix a country, the first thing you need to do is abolish the Office of National Statistics. Because it encourages people to meddle.
So laissez-faire in terms of regulation, but what were his tax policies?
Taxation was never more than about 15% of GDP. Which is a number, by the way, that goes all the way back to the Bible and the tithe. You know, you give a tenth of your earnings, and that number goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. And the idea of giving a tenth of what you earn they think it's because we have 10 fingers on our hands, and it was an easy number to calculate. So taxes never exceeded 15% of GDP, but about 40% of government tax revenue came from taxes on land. Land value tax. Income tax, there was no income tax except for very high earners. And so it was a totally different way of taxing people. And it worked beautifully well. The evidence is there.
No, I mean,
Hong Kong's achievement.
it was a massive success, and yet he's one of those people that very few people ever even heard of.
And it hasn't lost on the supply side either. You know, Hong Kong's transport system is fantastic. It has people live longer, healthier lives than pretty much anywhere else in the world. Its education system constantly ranks in the top 2 or 3 in the world. So it hasn't lost on the supply side. It's just the means by which those services are supplied is different to what we think in. And he basically just, people used to go, Keynes, and he said Keynes wasn't writing with us in mind.
Well, if anybody that's a keen student of history, this book is fascinating, and it talks about the Black Death and the American Revolution and all these things. No taxation without representation. It's all there. But that's just.
It's amazing, Nigel. Every war in history has been funded by taxation. Either during the event or afterwards, you plunder and then you tax. Every conquest is about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labour, the produce, the profit. Every revolt has been a revolt against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system, whether it's the Peasants' Revolt or the French Revolution, even the Gilets jaunes today. They're railing their initial
petrol taxes.
Petrol taxes.
Yep.
And taxes have shaped the course of human history. And once you start to look at the world through this prism of taxation, I'm going to play a little game with you now. Once you look at the world through this prism of taxation, so much suddenly becomes clear why things are as they are, what we need to do to change them. And one of the central arguments of this book is that name me any event from history, and there is almost always a tax story behind that event. So just shout out a random event and I'll tell you.
Well, I'm not sure that the Panzers crossing into France in 1940 was a tax event.
Who paid for it?
Well, all right, but that's indirect, isn't it?
No, it's still a tax story that taxation made that possible. And even things like, you think, the birth of Christ. Well, Mary and Joseph would not have been in Bethlehem had Augustus not levied a tax. The first men on the moon, NASA was a tax-funded operation. Every war, every revolt. The only thing where it's a grey area is natural disasters, because tax doesn't cause the natural disaster. Where the tax story comes in is in the effort to repair the damage.
And to mend things.
And which brings us to COVID-19 today.
We have income tax, of course, which pretty much came in this country at the time of the Napoleonic War, fitting in with your thesis. We're going through furlough, we're going through a most extraordinary range of government schemes. We've seen our national debt rise from 650 billion in 2010 to over 2 trillion now.
Extraordinary.
Under Conservative Prime Ministers, which is very interesting. And it seems to me that Rishi Sunak has already put warnings out that we're about to get taxed to bits. How do you see our tax future?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty ugly. There are 3 ways that you tax people. There's obviously taxes like income tax and so on, but there's inflation, debasing the currency, is another form of taxation. Milton Friedman called it taxation without legislation. I'm afraid, all this quantitative easing and so on that's going on.
At some point.
We're debasing the currency like mad. And then the third way you tax is debt, which is a tax on the future. And as you say, our debt's at £2 trillion.
Our children are going to be paying for this for a long time.
Oh my goodness me. We only finished paying off our debts for World War I about 4 or 5 years ago.
No, I know. and yet the way we raise tax and who we raise taxes from is being changed, I think, by 2 big phenomena. And they're both linked to technology. One is the sheer scale and magnitude now of Amazon, Google, these giants that now dominate the world. And the other, of course, I'm beginning to wonder whether it's cryptocurrency, which is kind of outside the purview of government. There is a very common perception here and across the Western world that the big global elites are not paying their fair share of tax. How do we deal with that?
I'm not sure you can, because the nature of the internet on which many of these global companies operate is the internet is pretty much a borderless medium, and you can put your trademark in one country that has a low, because there's effectively competition between natures. You put your IP in one place, you put your profit somewhere else, you do everything else. It's just very hard to tax these multinational corporations, and they some of them refer to tax as leakage. And but what's actually going to happen, Nigel, is that people are going to follow the same journey that these corporations have followed. And so currently income tax is about 50% of tax revenue in the UK, roughly. But more and more of us are going freelance. As we go freelance, we have multiple income streams. We start to work from home, and then lots of people with this COVID crisis, they're going, actually, do you know what? I've got my house in France. I'm going to go and work from France. Or do you know what? I'd like to live in Lisbon for a bit, and I can work remote, so I'll just go to Lisbon. Or I'm going to go to Thailand. And suddenly we're seeing the rise of this new workforce, the digital nomad. From freelance to digital nomads, and the estimates are that there will be, in a global workforce of 6 billion by 2035, 1 billion digital nomads, so 1/6 of the workforce. Now, it's not always clear who these people should pay tax to. If you're not resident in a country for more than 183 days a year, half of the year, you're no longer necessarily a citizen of that country. Now, in a lot of cases, these digital nomads want to pay. They're not avoiding tax deliberately. Some of them are, but a lot of the time they want to pay tax. It's just not clear to whom they pay it. And as we go into this sort of global citizenry, it's going to be very hard for governments to levy taxes, and so they're going to have to change the way they do that. And there's going to be so much pressure on government finance. On the one hand, there's pressure for them to increase their spending.
What a challenge this is to the nation-state model. Because,
it is.
And that's difficult for me, because I've been fighting for the nation-state model against this, as I see it, sort of globalist nightmare vision in Brussels. But we're kind of heading in a direction where it's difficult for governments to tax and spend in the way that they always used to.
Yeah, the nation state, as we know it, is defined by, it's dependent on its tax revenue to survive. Tax is power, whether it's king, emperor, government. If they lose their tax revenue, they lose their power. And it looks very likely. We saw yesterday the Scottish thing, 58% favour independence.
Well, we'll see when it comes to it.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But the nation state as we know it is under threat. And it's actually a relatively modern thing. We think they're sort of permanent, but they're only really 150 years old, a lot of them. And, in 50 or 100 years' time, countries might be much smaller. I'm standing for the independent nation of Cornwall.
Well, good luck with that. Good luck with that. I tell you, it's not easy. And I presume that Bitcoin...
We're going to hire you to do our IR.
Bitcoin, Ethereum, I mean, I could own these and I could pay for things with these and I could earn money through this and my government wouldn't know.
Absolutely.
I mean, they might ask me to declare it. But
sure, you're obliged to declare it.
Yes.
But one of the reasons that government have been able to grow taxes in the way that they have is that they control the system of money through the banking system. And, if they want to, they can force the banks to show, so they have control of that. And the interesting thing about the rise of the digital nomad is that over 50% of digital nomads work, trade and exchange using cryptocurrency. Not solely, but they have crypto as part of their life. Yeah. How do you tax it?
Yeah.
Particularly with the changing price of the cryptocurrency, even just, if I have mining shares in Canada, even just doing the exchange rate between Canada and the UK at different times of the year is a hellish job for my accountant. But once you bring in cryptocurrency, it's going to get very, very complicated.
And what next for Dominic Frisby?
I don't think I can bring myself to write another book, Nigel. I did this as an Edinburgh show in 2016. It was a show called Let's Talk About Tax.
It started off as a comedy.
It started off as a comedy show. And it wasn't that funny. It was more
well,
interesting.
It may not have been funny, but it's a really good read, Dominic.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
More songs is what's coming next.
Good.